טוב, טוב שלא מבין עברית.
זה עוד לא הקליט.
אז תפני אותו אליך ואחר כך לשאר הכיתה, בסדר? ובזהירות רק עם הכבלים כשאת מזיזה, בסדר? ואתם רואים אותו, הכל בסדר?
רוצה שאני אגביר, אני לא צריך. אפשר מזגן?
זה החימום. זה מביאו, זה קיבוצי, אולי כדאי לפתוח חלום. כולם פה?
נתחיל? אני חושבת שכן.
We're starting.
Okay.
We would like to begin by expressing our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Strozier for agreeing to be our guest today and for willing to share with us his profound insights that have been gathered over years of deep immersion in Cohortian theory and Cohort the man. Professor Strozier is Professor Emeritus of History at John Jay College and the Graduate Center of the University of New York. He is also a faculty member at the Trist Foundation and maintains a private psychoanalytic practice in New York City. Throughout his career, Professor Strozier has authored and edited numerous influential works. Notably, he wrote Heinz Cohort, The Making of a Psychoanalyst, a comprehensive biography of the founder of self-psychology. His latest book, The New World of Self, Heinz Cohort's Transformation of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, delves into Cohort's revolutionary contributions to psychoanalytic theory and practice. On a more personal level, we are currently in the 7th and final year of our Buddhist psychoanalytic training program, and we feel incredibly fortunate to have the opportunity to learn from you in person. The two topics that has been chosen for the next two sessions, self-state dreams and Cohort and spirituality, are truly of paramount importance for deepening and expanding our understanding, and for that we are deeply grateful. Today we will focus on the article about self-state dreams and the questions that have arisen from our reading of it. Without further ado, we would like to give the floor to Professor Strozier. Thank you once again for being here with us.
Well, thank you all for inviting me. My only regret is that I am not able to be there in person, but I feel virtually there and there in spirit. So I do want to begin by acknowledging we're talking about dreams today, the nightmare that Israel has suffered since on October 7th of last year, as well as the suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, along with others now as the war spreads. I also despair for the United States, which, as we just elected our own BB. The topic that I chose is the self-state dreams, which is really one of Cohort's, I think, more important contributions. There are many, of course, but the self-state dreams is one of the more dramatics innovations that he introduced into psychoanalytic theory and practice. Just to a little bit of background, I've always thought that Freud's best book was his dream book. And he identified any number of key ideas in the book, which I read more times than I would like to admit. But it identifies the significance of the day residue. That is, something occurs in the course of the dream day, that some event, some thought, something that's repressed, that then is the stimulus for the dream itself. He, of course, spent most of the book distinguishing between the manifest and the latent contents. The manifest, that is the dream itself, versus the latent thoughts that underlie, latent unconscious thoughts that underlie the dream. And then in his masterful chapter 6, he identified the dream process, the way the condensation of images, the displacement of affect, the process of symbolization, and the way all of the elements of the dream are cast, what he called secondary revision, cast into narrative form. For Freud, the significance of dreams it's not just that they were interesting, and they certainly were that, but they gave access to unconscious mental thoughts and processes. And it was that, and particularly access to what was his obsession and drive theory, the Oedipus complex. After Freud, with the exception of Jung, and I won't go into Jung unless you want to ask questions about it. But after Freud, the main emphasis in people writing about dreams, Thomas French, Ronald Fairbairn, and most importantly, Erik Erikson, the emphasis was to recover or redirect attention to what Freud had called the manifest content, that is the dream itself. And in that literature, the most important essay is Erikson's 1953 essay on the Irma dream, which is the first, that's in chapter 2 of Freud's dream book, and that is what Lifton calls the dream of all dreams, because it was the first great dream in psychoanalysis that Freud analyzes in depth. But all the thinkers failed, all of these things, most of all Freud, but even ego psychologists like Erikson and Fairbairn and others, they all failed to confront the significance of drive theory that was at the heart of the unconscious meanings of dreams. Particularly Erikson said some very interesting things about paying attention to the shape of dreams, the story of dreams, the topography of dreams, the relationship of various, literally the physical relationships of people in the dreams. But even Erikson, in the last analysis, fell back on drive theory as the essence of understanding what dreams are all about. Cohort's theory of the self-state dream is a paradigm shift because he understands dreams now within a vocabulary of self. And what Cohort called the self-state dream described the visual, symbolic, and narrative evocation of the current state of the issues, concerns, aspirations, and confusions in relationship to others, and in general of the self in the moment of the dream. Cohort agreed that with Freud that the dream located itself in the events of the dream day, the day residue, which is incidentally is very important for clinical work, clinical practice. And it's always certainly the way I practice when people have dreams is to begin with what is the day residue, and it opens up, what occurred yesterday that you can tie what thought, what image, what fantasy that was suppressed that you can tie the dream to in terms of the day residue. But while Freud agreed that the manifest content only mattered as the path to the unconscious dream thoughts, and the dream elements served simply as a way to understand early, especially Oedipal experience, for Cohort, the point was to stay with the dream and the self. Early experience in the formation of the self mattered a great deal for Cohort in a way that differed from Freud. The wonder of dreams is their symbolic complexity that brings early experience into focus via Cohort's idea of telescoping of genetically analogous experience. That's a quote. And so his metaphor is the telescope. In other words, Freud's emphasis is the dream is epiphenomenal, and what matters is the unconscious latent thoughts behind it, and therefore you go back into early experience in order to understand the dream. Cohort's metaphor reverses that with the idea of the metaphor of the telescope, and in that he reverses the emphasis from Freud's insistence on understanding latent content as the only real point of dream analysis. For Cohort, in dreams, the depths are on the surface, which was one of my formulations that I think begins to help explain what self-state dreams are all about. So in the appendix, which I sent along with the copy of the lecture in order to not repeat it, I indicate the various categories that I established in thinking about the Cohort's dreams and the dreams of those he supervised, mostly candidates, but not always, like Marion Tolpin, who was in an analysis with Cohort 3 times a week in the 1970s, but mostly the dreams that figure in much of his writings. For example, David Marcus, who was the analyst for Mr. E, and Mr. E is one of the cases that play an important role in the analysis of the self. So one of the questions that you asked was how I arrived at these categories, and I think the point of the question was there any template, any pre-existing basis for distinguishing the the categories that I established for describing in the appendix, describing every single dream. I mean, it took, believe me, a lot of work to compile this list of the 115 dreams. And the answer is it was really empirical. It was from the ground up. In other words, every dream, thinking about what it was, what it meant, and then coming across other dreams in other contexts that seemed to be in that same kind of categories. So the categories emerged empirically in the course of my work in thinking about every dream in the self-psychological corpus. So just to go through the categories, some of the grandiose self, I'm sure you've had patients with flying dreams, very common, and they pretty obviously relate to some kind of stirring of the grandiose self. Miss F, for example, this is a dream reported in the analysis of the self. Miss F dreamed of being in a playground and on a swing, and she went higher and higher, and soon went all the way around, and was flying in an exhilarating way as she went around the inner seat around the swing itself. And the other dream that actually was in one of the questions was and it's not Cohort doesn't, he talks about the dream, but he doesn't indicate which patient had it. But it was in a rocket circulating the globe far from Earth, but remained in orbit by the force of the force of gravity, which is pretty clearly the therapeutic tie to the analyst. Another kind of another category of self-state dreams are ones that come from the idealized self-object experience. And there, I think the most interesting example is Miss L, who in her adolescence, she had been raised a Catholic, and in her adolescence, she had a very idealized tie to a priest. And when she came into analysis in her 20s, she had several dreams of the priest, which merged into the analyst. And his comment was to, supposedly an attempt to make her see reality. He said, "Well, I certainly am not Catholic." And what it did was completely derail the analysis for 2 years until the therapist sought supervision from Cohort, and he kept going back, further back, and uncovered this initial profoundly unempathic comment by the analyst. There also are a number of anxiety dreams that I think come as a category of self-state dreams that come from disintegration anxiety that one feels from a sense of falling apart or fragmenting. And the a middle-aged lawyer, for example, the Cohort reports in his last book, remembered in therapy dreaming of falling off a tall building when he was 4. And that was a crucial point in his analysis when he was feeling great anxiety and a sense of fragmentation. He reported that his mother, in her unempathic way, took him when he told her the dream. She took him to the top of a skyscraper and forced him to look down. Another category is color dreams, especially those are in Technicolor. And this was actually Cohort's first insight into self-state dreams. And in the analysis of the self, before he actually had the term, he doesn't have the term self-state dreams until 1977 in the restoration of the self. But in the analysis of the self in 1971, he talks about these peculiar dreams that are in Technicolor, but they're not, they're in color. But what he noted is that they're not in normal colors. They're exaggerated color, sort of Technicolor, and that represents the what he argued then was the unmodified material in the ego, in the self. And Mr. A, for example, reported a dream that contained people who seemed like soldiers or puppets at a moment when his new self-image was slowly emerging. And he was excited about this new self, but it was filled with anxiety, and he was apprehensive, and the color in the dream was this unreal sharpness, this Technicolor, exaggerated color. Twinship dreams is another category. Mr. M, who was the beginning dream in the restoration of the self, Anna Ornstein's patient, he literally dreamed that he was part of a Siamese twin, and he was being led by his twin, and it felt harmonious and peaceful. Another category is humor dreams. There's some interesting example of humor in dreams. Mr. C, and this is the dream in the analysis of the self, he was looking forward to being publicly honored, and his dream was the question was finding a successor for me, and he thought, what about God? And in the dream he laughed, and then of course he reported in his report of the dream he was laughing, but it was not a simple matter, because as he talked about the humor in the dream, he realized that he had actually childhood fantasies in which he felt he was actually God. Cohen incidentally had a very good sense of humor, which I think you would have to have a good sense of humor yourself in order to appreciate the subtle ways in which some self-state dreams can be really quite introduce humor in some interesting way. So sexual dreams, as you might expect, proliferate in reports of dreams. I think I'm sure that I doubt that you would disagree with that. And there are lots of examples. But there also are termination dreams that can be really quite uh, uh, successful, quite interesting, though they sometimes have anxiety about the losing and mourning the therapist, but they also can be beautiful and calming in the sense of looking forward to moving forward in life with a new self that has been consolidated and made much more cohesive in the course of treatment. So that Mrs. Apple, who was a patient of Marion Topin, um, had her last dream was that she herself was one of the greatest architectural gems in the world. One of the miracles of the late Gothic style, the Saint-Chapelle in Paris, so that she imagined that she was the cathedral. Um, and and this dream was also in color, but the not the technicolor that showed the anxiety, but in regular color, which she experienced as calm and restful. Um, so let me skip that. There are also some dreams, rage dreams. Where and again, Mrs. Apple had some very interesting rage dreams at one point in her therapy when she was working through her anger at her mother. Um, she had a dream in which she was hurling massive rocks at her mother's car. And her mother had made her feel inadequate and ugly as a child. I would say that there's also a category of courage dreams, and this is the comes from the dreams of particularly Sophie Scholl's dream in the Courage paper, which I have a very special relationship to, since Cohort asked me, it was in a draft form, and toward the end of his life, he asked me to read it and uh, uh, revise it for publication. In fact, he died before I could complete the work with him. So I was left with a paper, this wonderful paper about the humble resistors to Nazism, the Hans and Sophie Scholl and Franz Jägerstätter, sort of ordinary Germans who resisted the horrors of what was happening, and went to their death as a result. And in Sophie Scholl's dream, the night before she was to be executed, is that she was carrying a child dressed in a long white garment to be baptized. The path to the church led up to a steep mountain, but she held the child firmly and securely. Suddenly there was a crevasse, an opening, a chasm, gaping in front of her, and she barely had enough time to deposit the child on the far side of it, and that she was able to deposit the child safely as she fell back into the chasm and died. So it's and Cohort in the paper spends a lot of time analyzing the sense of hope and sacrifice that Sophie Scholl indicated in that dream, and then she was quite calm in the next day as she faced execution. So, just to turn to some of the written questions that you sent me, and I'll just comment on these briefly, and then we can open for discussion. There were a couple of one question was that the whether there are two kinds of interpretation of dreams, whether the Freudian interpretation is the more for more mature, integrated, cohesive selves, and that what Cohort called narcissistic personality disorders, the NPDs, or the more troubled people with self disorders, whether self-shaped dreams are restricted to the more troubled and fragmented selves, and I think there actually were two questions which pretty much are ask the same question, and I think that it is reasonable to ask the question because Cohort himself, in his last formulation, in his final book, it argued that in fact you need to keep both theories of dreams in mind. That what Freud describes works for the more integrated and mature and cohesive selves, and the self-state dreams are more for the troubled and the fragmented. I think that's a contradiction, and I think dreams are self-state dreams. There are a lot of kinds of self-shaped dreams, as I try to argue in the categories that I was just talking about. They cover the landscape. Dreams are enormously complex, but I think it's a contradiction because it mixes the paradigms. The self-state dreams are within the vocabulary of self, and self, the point or the significance of the paradigmatic shift that Cohort introduced is to really save psychoanalysis from itself, to dispense with drive theory, which makes all kinds of absurd assumptions about human nature, and instead postulate a theory of self, which is not based in drive theory. The motivation is for behavior is not necessarily libidinal as it is in Freud, and on and on and on. But he struggled. He had such a traditional education and experience and commitment He read Freud in the 1940s after he came to Chicago with all of the intensity and commitment of a convert. And in the 1950s, when he was teaching at the Institute for Psychoanalysis in Chicago, he was Mr. Psychoanalysis. He was more Freudian than Freud, and he was completely orthodox. And beginning in the mid 1960s, he struggled to define a new sense of self, and the first book, which is his masterpiece in 1971, is filled with contradictions. He talks about his new ideas in the old language, and that's because he felt that was the most elegant way of the abstruse metapsychological language of ego psychology was the most sophisticated way of describing human behavior. But I think what he realized for the next decade, and he died in 1881, so his first book is 1971. He basically struggled to understand himself, and one can see that understanding unfold in a variety of ways, in a variety of ideas and concepts. But he because he was very sick the whole decade with cancer and struggling and really in not good health, he never was able to make his theory entirely consistent and work out all of the contradictions. That's the story that I tell in my biography, and that Raanan took the leadership on to translate into Hebrew, and it's a fascinating story of the discovery of new ideas. But one of the areas that he didn't fully resolve conceptually is the theory of dreams. And the theory of dreams, where he was arguing that we need to retain the Freudian idea when we're talking about one category, but then the self-state dreams. I think almost without question, dreams are best understood as some form of self-state dream. So another question, interesting question, about a hypothetical example illuminates the self-transformation and not psychosis. And the question takes the dream of the patient who is flying on a rocket around Earth, but what Cohort emphasized is that it goes into orbit, and so it doesn't lose itself as in psychosis. It doesn't fly off. The person who is the rocket flying around Earth doesn't fly off into space, but remains in orbit. And the question is that rather than considering it as not as a borderline with psychosis, but maybe the self of the dreamer is merging into a broader environment. Um, uh, and in such a, and the question is, in such a hypothetical patient, it would be manifest without an anxiety from psychosis, but as a potential of dissolving from a particular self form as an expression of selfhood. It's a interesting idea. And I think it would be one way to think about the spiritual expansion of of self, which is really at the heart of the Spirit Interest Institute. So we'd have to think more about that dream, but certainly that is um, an interesting way, yes, that in other words, a dream as a category, as a kind of self-state dream that uh, uh, represents a kind of a spiritual expansion of selfhood. I thought a lot about that question, and I couldn't really think of an example, but it's a very good question to ponder. So finally, there was a question about that I mentioned Robert J. Lifton approach to dreaming, and I don't know if you know. If you all read Lifton, but he's my guru. He's been my mentor for 45 years, and was enormously supportive of my biography of Cohort. But Robert, who has written 26 books, including, you may know, the Nazi doctors. He did a psychological interview study of the Nazi doctors. But Lifton, Robert has a paper on dreams, and he talks about the dreams often have a potentiality, a kind of future orientation to it, that in addition to whatever the dream identifies with in terms of the current state of the self and the current feelings and infusions or whatever, that it has a future dimension to it. And the question is, the dreams that express the movement from potentiality to the future, that that in fact is experienced as present in the dreams, that whether that kind of dream can serve as an ideal, and the question, as an ideal self object for the dreamer. And I thought about that, and I will end with a very personal dream that I think is an example of just that. So a year and a half ago, one of my sons died, and he had basically it was alcoholism. He was 47, and he had been a soldier in Iraq, actually, and but had childhood trauma with seeing his mother often in her alcoholism seem dead, and once he came back from Iraq, he was never able to get his life on track, and he died, as I say, a year and a half ago. And I knew that I needed to I needed my own therapy, and so I found in the couple of weeks after my son died, I started therapy with someone named Deborah, and she has a important background herself in she lived in Israel for a long time and a Jewish background, and she talked about in that period, that first 30 days, she talked about the Shloshim, which is a Kabbalistic idea. And I also I'm good friends with Orly Shoshani, and I was talking with her at the time, well, emailing, and she because I was trying to find a word to describe my state, that is, a parent who loses a child, and there is no such thing in English. And I looked in Chinese, I looked in all kinds of, and really the only word I found was the shakel in Hebrew. It's a word to describe the parent who loses a child. So I um, I found myself in my early work with Deborah, trying to follow my son Christopher's troubled, wandering soul, and I dreamed in that period of the Shloshim. I dreamed of several closed doors, but at the end, my therapist was in the distance, sitting astride a white horse by a stream, looking angelic, something out of a Renaissance painting. And I took hope in that image. And when I reported the dream to Deborah, she was astonished, and she told me that when, and this is a quote, when I was 18 or so, I had a life-changing dream, and in it I was transformed into a white Pegasus horse by a swan goddess, and was flying over a river between mountains. Your description, that's what she was telling me, your description of me with the horse and the stream reminded me of that dream, which touched my very soul. And I woke up after that dream, essentially transformed into the mystic I am today. So, in other words, without knowing anything about her dream, I had dreamed her transformative dream, which is at the very least a deep unconscious connection, but maybe even a suggestion of a mystical connection.
Wow.
So that's enough of me, and I would love to have some questions. We have plenty of time to. You've read my lecture, and now you've heard me talk about the self-state dream. So, what are your questions?
We should switch in if somebody else has any questions. This is a good time. First of all, I wanted to say that it was an inspiring and touching lecture, and we're still in it, but I had to say it. And the other thing is that there is another question that arose. It's a very general one, but maybe you can try to answer it. How do you define self-state?
How do I define? Well, I think the best way to define it is let me what Cohort called the self-state dream describes the visual, symbolic, and narrative evocation in the dream of the current state of the issues, concerns, aspirations, and confusions in relationship to others and one's life, in general, in the moment of the self, of the in that moment, the state of the self, so that the dream, the self-state dream is a way of imagining where we are in our self-concerns, in the way we're thinking at the very moment. Now, that where we are, particularly in therapy or in life, we may be grappling with something that is historic. We may be thinking about our parents or some trauma in childhood or some experience that is in the distant past, but that is current and focal in the moment. So that I gave the example of Mrs. Apple's dream, who was Marion Topin's patient, and Mrs. Apple was talking in therapy about her mother, and her mother, who, excuse me, I've got a left minute. Sorry, let my dog out of my study. My dog, I named my dog Lincoln. I wrote a couple of books about Abraham Lincoln. So much of my life has been concerned with Cohort and Abraham Lincoln. So Mrs. Apple's dream, what she was currently wrestling with was the way her mother had been cruel and had humiliated her and called her ugly when she was a child. And so she had the dream of hurling rocks at her mother's car. Okay, so she's filled with rage and anger at her mother. So you can say a Freudian would interpret that dream as the latent content of the dream is really a cover for her feelings about her mother and her childhood conflicts and disappointments and shame by her mother. But I think the more interesting and self-state interpretation is, first of all, it has nothing to do with libido. There's no libidinal motivation in the dream of Miss Apple, hurling rocks, throwing rocks at her mother's car. But it's what she was at the time currently talking about and wrestling with and thinking about in her therapeutic work with Marion Topin. And the dream is a self-state dream because it evokes, it's a symbolic, evocative, narrative evocation of what she is struggling with in the moment to define herself. Okay, so well, another example, a good example that I indicated in the paper I sent you, but it's worth remembering, is Cohort's own dream. He wrote this extraordinary paper, disguised case, the two analyses of Mr. Z. And it's sheer autobiography. So it's a disguised version of himself. And it published it in a major international review of psychoanalysis. So we published it in a major paper, a major journal, and it has always bothered people that he basically lied about this case. But I think that's a superficial analysis. He wrote the paper about telling the story of a deeper meaning of himself and autobiographical, but he couldn't, for various reasons, tell that story of himself except in a disguised way. So it was a truth wrapped in the riddle of a lie. Anyway, the case is, I mean, except for Freud's dream book, there's never been a psychoanalyst. Well, maybe Jung would be an exception, but there's never been a psychoanalyst who is so honestly told his own story and explored his own self experience. And one of the conceit of the paper is that Mr. Z was a patient of Cohort's when he was in his Freudian phase. And he has a 5-year analysis, and he is better but not well at the end of it. And then the 5 or so years goes by, and Mr. Z comes back for a second analysis with Cohort, and he is then in his Cohutian self-analytic phase, and he does a second analysis, and there are the contrast. I mean, the paper is really a beautiful paper to read for understanding the difference at the granular level, the difference between self-psychology and traditional psychoanalysis in Cohort's telling, because he's also talking about himself. But there are two dreams that he mentioned, several dreams, but there are two dreams that are really sort of paradigmatic and worth commenting on in this context. That that suggests the radical difference between a self-state dream and the Freudian interpretation of a dream. And one is at the end of his first, the first dream I'll talk about, is at the end of his first analysis. He had a dream that his father, who had been gone between the time he was 2 and 5, and in fact, Cohen's father was off in the First World War between the time that Cohen was about 1.5. He was born in 1913 and the war started in 1914, and his father went off, fought on the Russian front, and then returned at the end of the war. He remained depressed for the rest of his life, the father. But in the dream at the end of the first analysis, his father is at the door, and the father is got a packages, gifts in his arms, and the boy Cohort is at the door and trying to close the door and not let his father in. And the obvious interpretation, the Freudian traditional interpretation of that dream, is that he had long had edible possession of the mother while the father was away, and his father returns. He fears castration as punishment for his sole possession of the mother. So he wants to close the door in order not to let the father in. So there you have a dream, you have the latent thoughts, the manifest dream and the latent thoughts, which are entirely edible. What Cohort realized, the meaning of the dream as a self-state dream at the end of Mr. Z's second analysis, is that the boy, and this was at a point in his self-understanding that when he was grappling with understanding his longing for a father figure, for the agony of missing his father for all those years, and finally, and of course, Cohort had a very difficult mother, as if you have read my biography, Elsa was quite a piece of work. But the longing for a father figure and the sense of loneliness and despair that he felt, and suddenly his father's at the door and he's loaded with packages, and the reason he's closing the door and trying to prevent in the dream and trying to prevent his father from walking in is that he was overstimulated, and that he felt the anxiety of that he couldn't handle the excitement and the overstimulation of his father walking in. So, in other words, the deeper meaning, the self-psychological, the self-state dream meaning of the dream has nothing to do with the Oedipus complex, has nothing to do with libidinal desires, had nothing to do with the sexual possession of the mother, but it had to do with wanting the father, longing for the father to be there, which is it seems to me is a much better interpretation of that dream. And the second dream he talks about is about Elsa, his mother. And when he was grappling toward Mr. Z / Cohort was grappling with the full, well, not the full, but the meanings of Elsa, his mother, and the way her crypto, what he calls her crypto psychosis, and her paranoia and incredible intrusiveness and the trauma that she caused him. He had a dream when he was as a self-state dream. He had a dream of Elsa standing naked with her backside facing him, so he could see Elsa. And this was a point at the most critical time of Cohort grappling with the full meaning of his crypto, as he calls crypto, that is partially, I don't know what crypto psychotic means, but certainly deeply troubled mother who had caused a lot of trauma for him. And he realizes that the Freudian interpretation would be that the mother is standing naked with her back to him because she's missing the penis. In other words, it's something absent. It's a drive interpretation of the dream, and the horror and anxiety that he feels is because he can't see the missing penis. Well, that's a ridiculous interpretation of that dream. And what Cohort says about his own interpretation of what the dream means is that the terror that he felt is because he can't see her eyes. She's through a glass darkly, and the terrific anxiety at the moment that he was wrestling with his own feelings of the need to separate, to be apart from the annihilation that he feared from his mother, which was really the struggle of his childhood, of Cohort's childhood. She turned away from him in the dream with icy coldness, and so he dreams of her with her back to him, and the terror, as I said, the terror of the dream is that he can't see her eyes. So those are two very evocative dreams that Cohort had himself, that I think both of which are really illustrate very well the nature of self-state dreams.
Do you think we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. So here it is.
So, I'll read it with your permission. In light of all you have just said and the misunderstanding that might occur in classic interpretation of dreams, can you maybe say something about how practically you suggest to work with dreams in analysis? What would you do, especially what you would not do? Because in your article, you suggest that, to start with what's up with you today and not start going. But you suggested what to do, but what do you think one should not be doing? Because the examples you just gave, also the personal, very, very touching one, but the theoretical ones especially show how there can be a huge misunderstanding if interpreting one way or another.
Right.
It might be quite a long answer, so we can also go on next time.
That's right. That's a very good question. And yeah, I'm really glad you brought it up because I should have addressed it. Freud was very specific in the way he recommends in his dream book that you take apart a dream. And he recommended what he called free association, right? Free association is generally the rule in psychoanalytic theory, but particularly with dream interpretation, what he recommended was take each element of the dream and recognizing that the dream is a collection of symbols in the process of symbolization. And each symbol has been condensed through condensation, and the affect has been displaced. So you take each element and then you free associate to the element for as long as you need to. And then in those associations, in the free association, leads you to some glimmer of understanding of what the unconscious latent thoughts are. And then you can see the deeper meaning of the dream. Cohort completely disagreed with that. Since the dream is, it's the dream itself that matters. As I said, my formulation for Cohort, the depths are on the surface. In other words, what matters is the dream itself. And the dream itself is an evocation of the current state of the self. That's why there's self-state dreams. And so therefore it's the feel, it's the overall sense of the dream. So that if I had somebody who was like Cohort's dream of his mother, Elsa, if I were dealing with a patient at that point, and the patient was grappling with his feelings about his cryptopsychotic mother and trying to break free of the tyranny of her hold on him, and he came in with a dream about his mother standing naked with her back to him. I would ask him, why do you think she's standing with her back to you?
Mhm.
That's the salient image in the dream. That would be one that pretty example, a dramatic example of a dream. I think more commonly you find the dream which, a patient will dismiss. Oh, I had a crazy dream last night, and I have no idea what it means. I find it useful to begin with the day residue. I think that was one of Freud's enduring insights, the significance of the day residue, because it just as a way of beginning to think about the dream. So you begin by identifying what occurred yesterday that might have stimulated the thought of the dream. And then it's it's the overall gestalt of the dream. It's not a series of images and symbolic images. They are a series of symbolic images, but the most important thing is what's the gestalt of the dream? What's the wholeness? How does it tie into the current state of the dreamer's life and the current state of what they're dealing with or struggling with, or the trauma that they're trying to understand. And you know, I told you my personal story when I had that dream of my analyst on the white horse in the mountainside, looking angelic, something out of a Renaissance painting. And then she responded, you know, she didn't respond by asking me about what the meaning of the horse was, right? Or why I was a Renaissance painting, but she responded to what the dream stimulated in her, the memory of her own dream, which was a transformative dream for her. And you know, somehow in that moment in my own life, I had dreamed a version of her transformative dream, which is mystical and spiritual, which is our assignment for next week, right?
So if there are any specific instructions, you can write us or tell us, and we will prepare everything that is needed. I just wanted to say that thank you on behalf of all of us for this exquisite and touching lesson. It was truly enlightening, and we're looking forward to our next lesson with you. Next
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
אין לנו כרגע מאמרים.
לא, יש לו שאלה.
הספר שלו.
בספר